This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, which I encourage you to join today. You can also follow them on social media and check out their website, which is regularly updated with new blog posts, call for papers and similar. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a great collection of books about animal studies. At time of recording, the release of the next book is just around the corner, and that's Decolonising Animals, edited by Rick DeVos. I was intrigued to see that the book contains a chapter on archaeology as an approach to animal studies, which regular listeners will remember was something we discussed on Knowing Animals a few months ago. Also, a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Now, today I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr Rachel Robison-Green, an assistant professor of philosophy at Utah State University. She works in metaethics, ethics, and epistemology. Rachel does lots of really interesting work challenging stereotypes about what philosophers do and who philosophy is for. For example, she's edited or co-edited no fewer than 12 books in the Blackwell Philosophy and Pop Culture series, including American Horror Story and Philosophy. And I mentioned that one only because I happen to be a big fan of American Horror Story. But today we're not here to talk about American Horror Story, maybe another time, but another subject very close to my heart, and that's cultivated meat. And the reason we're talking about that is that Rachel is the author of Edibility and In Vitro Meat Ethical Considerations, which was released in 2023 by Lexington Books. Welcome to the podcast, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So can you start by telling us what led you to work on the topic of in vitro meat?
Like so many things in my career, I sort of came to this in an unusual way. I'd written a lot of public philosophy pieces on this topic. And I'd also written a case study for the Bioethics Bowl so that students around the United States were talking about this issue. I had some papers that I'd produced on the topic, and I had given some of them at conferences and was approached by Lexington Press to write a book.
So let's start with the basics. And this is something we talked about on Knowing Animals before, but I think there are misconceptions about this. So what is cultivated meat? Or perhaps I should say, what is in vitro meat? Because, of course, naming is a part of this conversation. So while I've used cultivated meat, you're using in vitro meat.
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest misconception about this topic is that in vitro meat is plant-based. Like even when I have my students write on this topic, even when I have them read sections from the book, they still come away sometimes thinking that it's like impossible or beyond. But in vitro meat or cultivated meat involves taking a biopsy of an animal and then growing cells in a lab, essentially, until you can produce a particular kind of meat that should, in theory, ideally, taste like meat produced via slaughter of animals in factory farms, only without the slaughter and without the cruelty.
So why do you use in vitro rather than cultivated? Was that a conscious decision on your part?
I use cultivated. I use them interchangeably throughout the book, but did use in vitro in the title. And there's no particular reason I could have easily gone with cultivated. But there is a rigorous debate about how we should market this, what we should call it. And I don't know if it's going to end up being in vitro or cultivated, because I don't know that either of those sound particularly appetizing.
Yes.
I've also heard green meat, which also doesn't sound very appetizing. So we've got to... The people who are good at marketing need to put their heads together and come up with a plan.
Yes, I think that's fair enough. But let's ask the other side of the question, because this does seem to be a philosophical question. Mm-hmm. Do you think that it's right to call this meat?
So I know here in the United States, we're facing a lot of backlash over that very idea. Even with the idea of milk, although the FDA has recently come out with a decision on this, that nut-based milks, soy-based milks can be called milk, but the industrial animal agriculture lobby here really wants to see to it that we're not calling these more humane products, milk or meat. But I think that's to refuse to call anything other than meat produced via slaughter meat seems disingenuous. It just seems agenda driven. I mean, the word meat hasn't always meant flesh anyway, right? It just means the edible part of something. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything inauthentic or disingenuous about calling it meat produced in vitro meat.
So let's move on to the ethical side of things. I think it's fair to say that you see cultivated meat as something that we should embrace as a non-ideal solution to the harms that our food system currently inflicts on animals and indeed the planet and humans. So could you introduce us to this kind of central argument?
There's a question about what we should be doing when we're engaging in ethics. Should we be striving toward the ideal, toward what we would do in a perfect world? Or do we take the imperfections of the world as a given and try to craft policy in light of that? And I think that that's the space that we're in here. I think that there's very little chance that everybody's going to become vegetarian or vegan overnight. And so we need to be thinking about strategies that can end the tremendous amount of cruelty that we're perpetrating against animals. And in vitro meat is one way to do that.
So my next question was going to be, so do you see a place for in vitro meat in an ideal theory, in like a perfectly just world? But I suppose your answer could just reasonably be, well, that's not an interesting question.
I do think it's an interesting question, really, actually. I think it depends on the theory that you embrace. And I personally, my strategy in this book was to kind of be neutral with respect to theory. I think that any moral theory can support in vitro meat, ultimately. I think that it doesn't violate rights. I think that it is in line with the best set of consequences. I don't think it's problematic from a care perspective. And so once that's said, you might think then why wouldn't it have a perfectly reasonable place within an ideal theory? I guess I'm sort of sympathetic to the idea that we ought to leave other entities' bodies alone, other sentient beings' bodies alone, if we reasonably can. But then again, I make the argument in the book that how we ought to treat something should probably have something to do with the kinds of preferences it's capable of having. And so I don't know that many non-human animals, anyway, are capable of caring what happens to their cellular material. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. It might have a place within an ideal theory, but it definitely has an important place within a non-ideal theory.
So in earlier chapters, as you mentioned just there, you explore utilitarian arguments for and against cultivated meat. And I think perhaps the most interesting passages of those chapters, in my view at least, involve getting into some very interesting, very sophisticated discussions about the ethics of creation and matters related to that. Now, I worry that it'd be hard to do that kind of topic justice in the time that we have for this podcast. So instead, I'd like to move on to your discussion of rights theory in chapter 4. Now, this was really interesting to me for two reasons. First, I believe I'm right in saying that you've spent some time working closely with the archive of Tom Regan, who's the author of The Case for Animal Rights. So you had some insights on where he might stand on cultivated meat. And second, you argue that producing cultivated meat could be consistent with respecting animal rights, which is a claim that I think some people might feel is quite surprising. So could you introduce us to the arguments that you make in this chapter on rights?
When you asked me the question about how I got involved in this project, one crucial piece of this that I should have mentioned was that in 2019, I was the Tom Regan Animal Rights Fellow, which meant that I spent a summer in the Tom Regan Animal Rights Archive doing research. Now, I think everybody is aware from reading the bulk of Regan's work that he's an abolitionist, and that he thinks that we should totally abandon the use of animals in research, the use of animals in industrial animal agriculture, and so forth. But he does, in various places throughout his work, talk about circumstances under which it would be acceptable to bring about some very minimal level harms in order to produce some significant gains. Two passages that come up in his work. One that he labels the principle of qualified non-malfeasance, where he says, "We can justify overriding an innocent being's rights in the name of minimizing evil if A, we have very good reason to believe that a very great amount of evil will be reduced or prevented if we treat him or her in a way that is contrary to one of his or her rights. B, the sort of evil we're talking about is the sort that is seriously injurious or harmful to the good of other beings or to their pursuit of it. C, those other beings are themselves innocent. And D, we have very good reason to believe that there is no other realistic way open to us to bring about so vast a reduction in the amount of evil, or to prevent so vast an amount, or to reduce or prevent amounts nearly so vast than by treating an individual in a way that's contrary to the right in question. So I think that passage suggests a way, at least on Reagan's view, forward toward an in vitro meat proposal. Now, not all rights theorists are Reagan adherents, but I think that that's one passage in Reagan that allows for it. And then also the mini-ride principle that says special considerations are aside, and this is actually in the case for animal rights itself. Special considerations aside, when we must choose between overriding the rights of many who are innocent and the rights of few who are innocent, and when each affected individual will be harmed in a prima facie comparable way, then we ought to choose to override the rights of the few in preference to overriding the rights of the many. Again, I'm not sure that taking a bit of cellular material from an animal counts as overriding their rights. Animals don't have preferences with regard to whether their cellular material is taken. But if indeed that violates some sort of right to bodily autonomy, there's at least some textual support within Reagan for that position.
I think some of the most original arguments in the book come in chapters 7 and 8, and you've alluded to them a little bit in your discussion of Reagan there. So in chapter 7, you argue that the in vitro meat movement can sever the notion of edibility from the features that make it a moral concept. I'm quoting you there. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we tend to think of edibility as a morally loaded notion, that there are sort of moral principles built in to what it is for something to be edible. And I think that the technology of in vitro meat demonstrates that really the moral elements of edibility, that what we take to be sort of baked in elements of edibility, are really reducible to other things. So I'm thinking about a number of different cases. So if we say, for example, that it's wrong to eat the flesh of grandma, okay, then one thing we might be saying is that there's something just intrinsically wrong with eating grandma. But I think the fact that we could cultivate the flesh of a human being demonstrates that if that action is wrong, it's wrong for other reasons. Like perhaps in the case of an entity like a human who's capable of caring about what happens to their cellular material, it might be wrong because we're violating autonomy. We're not respecting grandma's ability to give consent. In other cases, we might feel like harvesting meat demonstrates disrespect because there are a particular set of intentions that we don't want to encourage or nurture or something like that. But I think that this technology demonstrates that it's not edibility itself that's a moral concept. It's really reducible to other properties.
So you don't think there's any problem per se in seeing other humans as edible, in seeing dogs and cats as edible, in seeing endangered species or even extinct species as edible?
That's right. I think once thinking about them as edible does them no harm and violates none of their rights, if viewing them as edible doesn't reduce them to objects, which I think in this case it doesn't, because we're taking their cellular material. I mean, it might be the distinction between treating something as a means and treating as a mere means. That's maybe one analogy, that like one can respect someone's full range of rights, respect their autonomy if they're the kind of being that is autonomous, while at the same time using their material. They're no longer an absent referent, as Carol Adams discusses this in Sexual Politics of Meat. She talks about one of the problems with eating something being that there's this absent referent. The referent is still very much alive, and we're still very much respecting it.
In chapter 8, you explore a question that I've not heard put in these terms before, and in my view, it's probably one of the most original arguments in the book. You explore, quote, the nature of the relation that exists even between a being and a very small portion of her body. Could you explain what you mean by this and why it's an important question?
So one of the cases that got me thinking about this was the case of Henrietta Lacks and HeLa cells. Most people are probably familiar with this case study, but Henrietta Lacks had a biopsy done in order to have a medical test for cancer. And then it was ultimately found that there was a feature of her cells that had a remarkable property. And they were then subsequently, without Henrietta Lacks's permission, used for all sorts of medical interventions, medical innovations. And until very recently, it was not acknowledged that her family was entitled to anything, but that's a different question, really. And so thinking about this, I thought, and I think it tends to be most people's intuition, that there's something really wrong with part of her body being taken and used in ways that she didn't consent to and that she wasn't compensated for. But I think that, as I'm thinking about this kind of case, I'm thinking, it seems like it goes beyond just a simple property right here. It doesn't seem like all that is violated is Henrietta Lacks's right to a thing, right? This is a portion of her body. And I think that this is for the same reason we're very apprehensive about organ donation and those types of coercive organ donation and things like that, because parts of people's bodies people stand in a certain kind of special relation to their own body. So I argue for this view that an existential kind of approach to viewing parts of one's own body, where really one stands in a very special relation to one's own body. It's your body that provides you with reasons to act and to live. And though no individual part of your body may be identical to you, they all give rise to the conditions for life. And so that gives us a special obligation to respect that, and to respect in particular the preferences one has with regard to the particular pieces of their body. But then I argue that many non-human animals, perhaps all non-human animals, don't have preferences with regard to small bits of their cellular material. And so in vitro meat doesn't violate that unique relation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So that might mean that we actually have very strong reason to treat the creation of, say, human flesh very different to the creation of, say, pig flesh, because of that different relationship that people have with their bodies than pigs do.
Sure. I mean, I grappled with this question, and I don't think it actually, this scenario actually made it into the book, but I was thinking about, what if there was a person in a persistent vegetative state and we proposed using their cellular material to make food? I think probably for most people that sounds really dystopian and terrible. And that probably has something to do with norms. Even if that individual person is never capable of giving consent again, it probably has to do with norms surrounding how human beings feel about human bodies. And maybe that's something that ought to be respected, at least for pragmatic reasons.
Let me ask you about something else that didn't really make it into the book, but I'm sure you thought about, which is other so-called cellular agricultural technologies, like precision fermentation used to produce dairy. Do you think what you've written in the book would also apply to these kinds of technologies?
Absolutely. These are exciting new technologies that I'm supportive of. I'm hoping that someday it will be possible to completely replace animal products gained via cruelty using culture technology.
Let me ask you a question which isn't very philosophical, but which I'm sure you're asked all the time. Would you eat in vitro meat?
I would, although it's not as if I have some burning desire to, because I haven't eaten meat in a very long time and it doesn't sound particularly appetizing to me. And but I probably would give it a try. Yeah.
Now, Rachel, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yes, and this is like pretty cliche, but it was Animal Liberation. And it was one of the most impactful books of my life, really. It meant a lot to me. I've read it many, many times since.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Sure. It was my first paper as an undergraduate, and I submitted it to a competition and won, which was really fun. I just read Animal Liberation. I was probably 18 or 19. I had just read Animal Liberation, and I was also taking a course on the metaphysics of death, and had read like Nagel and Williams on the badness of death. And so I wrote an article or a paper really, on the badness of death for animals. This was probably in 2001 or something like that. Then later on, I'm still interested in that question. So I taught a course on metaphysics of death, and we did a unit on badness of death for animals.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
That's probably the most difficult question of this set. I guess I would have to say Tom Regan, because of the time that I spent in the archive. And he was just so very, very generous with all the work of his life. So in the archive, he gave every paper he'd ever written, every bit of research he'd collected. So they were just folders and folders full of research that he had done on animal research. Some of the most interesting stuff that was in there was on the AIDS crisis and use of animals for research during the AIDS crisis. He also had this really great course that he taught, and within the archives were his syllabus and his course materials. It was called the course was called The Moral Community, and it was a great course. Really, I think that how we might portray it now is a course on intersectionality and oppression, the different ways that oppression is connected and compounding oppressions and things like that. And that's just made a huge difference for my teaching. Of course, the case for animal rights was extremely impactful, and so was Empty Cages.
Let me interrupt my regular questions then to push on this a little bit.
Sure.
You're talking about this archive and the work you did in the archive. Is this accessible to other researchers? If other people are hearing this and think, oh, I want to be involved in this, how can they get involved?
Well, a lot of the material has been scanned and is available online. So it's a great archive for that reason. I've continued to do research in the archive just from home. So it's the Tom Reagan Animal Rights Archive at North Carolina State. And then I'll also mention that they do this. Well, I'm on the board of the Cultural Animals Foundation, which is the organization that Tom Reagan started to promote not only scholarly work, but also creative artistic work on the topic of animals. And they have this, as I mentioned earlier, they have this fellowship that they give to either one or two scholars every year. In 2021, we gave it to two scholars. Well, that was in part because we didn't have a scholar in 2020 because of the pandemic, but where a person can apply into it. And then if they're selected, they get to spend a whole summer there doing research. So there's more than one way to get involved. And I highly encourage it. It was one of the most meaningful experiences of my career so far.
And to return to the regular questions, what do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Well, I wanted to offer an anecdote to support how I want to answer this question. So I remember in the archive, Tom Reagan describing going to a conference, and at the conference, he was at the hotel bar or something, and someone came up to him and said, "I saw that there's a paper on animal ethics in this conference. They'll just let anything in." And he was very taken aback by that. And it's noteworthy to me that even now there's some. This is maybe true with all of applied ethics, but the profession, the way the profession views discussion of animals is not the way that they should view discussion of animals. I think it's critical to know animals, to understand animals, right, for their own sakes, right? But I think it's also very important for philosophy, if we're going to understand human beings, for us to have a better understanding of animals, because we are animals, and so when we develop theories about reason or intention or agency or identity, we shouldn't do that as if those are concepts that only apply to human beings. We should understand ourselves as part of the group that we are indeed a member of. And so I think that philosophers working on animals should do what they can to change the narrative. And I think they are.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human, non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think we need to stop treating animals as things and start understanding them for the complex beings that they are.
What are you working on next?
I've got a couple of papers, both sort of in a similar vein. So I didn't go into philosophy working on animal issues, even though that was what my first paper was about. I went into metaethics and worked on normativity and reasons for action and things like that. So I was looking a lot at the work of Christine Korsgaard and Harry Frankfurt. And I found that there's a lot that I wanted to say about their work, which I admire and think is impressive work. But I also think that it has implications for animals that are not great. Even though Korsgaard, as friends of animal philosophy know, does some work in animal philosophy and is passionate about protecting animals, I think that the distinctions that she draws between animals or non-human animals and humans aren't defensible, really. So she understands herself as being part of this tradition that I think we need to get rid of, which is, or not, we don't need to get rid of the tradition, but I think we need to move on and grow this tradition of understanding having kind of a hierarchical view of the animal kingdom, including ourselves, where humans sit at the top. She views herself as part of the Aristotelian tradition, where she's identifying the things that set human beings apart. And I think it's really important for us to focus instead on the ways in which we're similar. And so I focus in particular on the use that Korsgaard and Frankfurt make of introspection and reflective endorsement, because there's this line throughout both thinkers that really what makes us persons, what makes us capable of agency, is our ability to introspect and to endorse what we're finding when we introspect. And I think the empirical social science suggests that that's really just confabulation, a good majority of it. When we introspect, we're not finding something authentic. We're creating what we want to see. And if that's the case, if we're not finding something true upon introspection, then it seems ridiculous to use introspection as the dividing line between humans and non-human animals. And so I'm pursuing conceptions of personhood and agency that try to abandon those kinds of approaches in favor of dispositional approaches that are more favorable to animal agency.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's quite different from the kind of animal ethics work you're doing here. Much more theoretical, much more kind of philosophical. And I mean that in the best possible way. That's really interesting.
Thanks.
So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, I have a personal website, which is brand new. So if you want to find out more about me, you can just Google me and find that.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do tell others about the podcast and write a review. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.